Edward Stanton built his life on control, precision, and power. He never let anything disrupt his plans, until a small hand gripped his wrist in the middle of a crowded airport. He looked down and met a pair of wide blue eyes, not just filled with confusion, but fear. "Please," the girl whispered. "Don't let go." For the first time in his life, Edward had no idea what to do next. Edward Stanton had never been a man who believed in fate. His life was built on discipline, precision, and careful planning, where every decision was calculated to bring him success. The airport was just another stop in his well-structured life, a transition point between one destination and another, a place where people came and went without a second thought. He walked through the terminal with his usual air of confidence, his mind already focused on the week ahead. A private jet awaited him on the tarmac, ready to take him to Europe for a long-overdue vacation. It wasn't that he needed the time off, Edward never needed a break, but his assistants had insisted, reminding him that even the most powerful executives required rest. He had agreed, if only to silence their concerns. As he approached the security checkpoint, his phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down at the screen, scanning through the latest market reports. Everything was as expected, numbers rising exactly as he had predicted. A deal he had been working on for months was set to finalize, and by the time he landed in Paris, another acquisition would be secured. Everything was under control. Until it wasn't. A small hand suddenly grabbed his wrist, firm but trembling. He tensed instinctively, his body going rigid at the unexpected contact. Edward was not a man accustomed to being touched without permission. His head snapped up, prepared to pull away, to demand an explanation, but the words never left his lips. A little girl stood before him. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her straight blonde hair fell just past her shoulders, slightly disheveled as if she had been running. Her bright blue eyes that mirrored his own, were wide with fear, her lips slightly parted as though she had meant to say something but had lost the courage at the last second. Edward frowned, glancing around. The airport was crowded, filled with families, business travelers, and tourists, yet no one seemed to notice her. There were no frantic parents searching nearby, no security officers rushing over to assist. She was alone. He looked back down at her, forcing himself to soften his voice. "Are you lost?" The girl tightened her grip on his wrist, her small fingers pressing against his skin. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." Edward's breath hitched, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. He had handled hostile negotiations, multi-million-dollar mergers, and the collapse of entire companies without blinking an eye. Yet, standing here, looking into the desperate gaze of a child, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, her blonde hair falling into her face. "I don't know." Edward studied her carefully. There was no hysterical crying, no panicked wailing for her mother or father. Just fear. Quiet, controlled fear, as if she understood far more than a child her age should. "What's your name?" he asked. For the first time, she hesitated. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing together, as if she were trying to remember. Then, almost too quietly, she whispered, "I don't know." Edward's pulse quickened. "You don't know your own name?" She shook her head again, her small fingers still clinging to his wrist. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a lost child wandering away from her parents. This was something else. Edward had planned every detail of his day, from the moment he left his penthouse to the second he would board his plane. But nowhere in those carefully laid out plans had he accounted for this. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuff with his free hand. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out." The girl's grip tightened for just a second before loosening slightly, as if his words had given her the smallest amount of reassurance. Edward Stanton had never believed in fate. But standing there, with a lost child holding onto him like he was her last hope, he had a feeling his life was about to change in ways he could have never anticipated. Edward Stanton had never been the kind of man to hesitate. His life was structured around quick, decisive action. Every deal he closed, every negotiation he entered, every calculated risk he took had been built on the certainty that hesitation led to failure. Yet, standing in the middle of a crowded airport with a little girl gripping his wrist like a lifeline, he found himself frozen, unsure of his next move for the first time in years. The girl was small, fragile-looking but composed in a way that didn't seem natural for a child her age. She wasn't crying, wasn't calling out for her parents, wasn't even looking around in search of someone familiar. Instead, she stood still, holding onto him with quiet determination, as if she had already decided that he was her only chance. Edward forced himself to think logically. The first step was security. They would have a protocol for lost children, a system in place to locate her parents or guardians. It was the simplest, most rational solution. Yet, when he started to move in the direction of the nearest security checkpoint, the girl pulled back. Her grip on his wrist tightened, her small fingers pressing into his skin with surprising strength. "No," she whispered. Edward stopped, glancing down at her. "They can help find your family," he said, keeping his voice calm. She shook her head, her blonde hair shifting slightly with the movement. "No. Please. Not them." Something in her voice, something raw and urgent, made him pause. He studied her, searching her face for answers she wasn't giving him. "Why not?" She looked around then, scanning the crowd with wide, wary eyes, her fingers still locked around his wrist. When she turned back to him, her voice was barely audible. "I don't think they're looking for me." Edward's stomach tightened. "Your parents?" he asked carefully. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "The people I was with." He narrowed his eyes. "Who were they?" She opened her mouth as if to answer, then quickly closed it, her entire body tensing. It was as if something had shifted in her mind, some warning that had been ingrained deep inside her, stopping her from saying too much. Edward exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with his free hand, more out of habit than necessity. "All right," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear he wasn't going to push her, yet. "Then what do you want me to do?" The girl swallowed hard, her grip on him unwavering. "Don't let go." Edward wasn't sure why those words settled so heavily in his chest. He had spent his life keeping people at arm's length, maintaining a distance between himself and anything that resembled vulnerability. Even as a child, he had learned that attachment was a liability, that emotions were unpredictable and dangerous. He had built walls around himself that no one had ever broken through. And yet, here was this little girl, asking him for something so simple, something he had never given to anyone, his presence, his protection. He exhaled and nodded. "Okay." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, enough for him to realize just how much she had been bracing herself for rejection. He glanced around the terminal, his mind working through his next steps. He couldn't just stand there with her indefinitely, but he also couldn't ignore the way she flinched at the thought of being taken by security. If she was afraid of the people who were supposed to be looking for her, that meant something was very wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts before tapping on a number. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sir." "James," Edward said, his tone brisk. "I need you to meet me at the airport immediately. Something's come up." His assistant didn't question him. "Right away." Edward ended the call and looked down at the girl. "We're going to figure this out. But I need you to trust me." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I do." Edward wasn't sure why that one small sentence settled something inside him. But he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't letting her go. Edward stood with the little girl in the middle of the airport terminal, his mind racing through every possible scenario. The logical part of him knew the easiest course of action would be to hand her over to airport security, let them handle the situation, and board his flight as planned. That was what any reasonable person would do. That was what made sense. But something about her hesitation, about the way she had gripped his wrist and refused to let go, about the quiet fear in her bright blue eyes, told him that this wasn't a simple case of a lost child waiting to be reunited with her family. He had spent years making fast, efficient decisions that benefited his business. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a 6-year-old girl, standing beside him, clutching his sleeve like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't speak as they stood there, watching the flow of people around them. Her fingers had loosened slightly, but she hadn't let go of his hand. Edward glanced down at her. "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to force the words out. After a long moment, she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think I do. But it's not all there." Edward frowned. He had heard of trauma-induced memory loss before. He had read about it in passing, in reports about cases where people had blocked out certain events after experiencing something too overwhelming to process. But he had never seen it firsthand. He crouched down slightly, keeping his voice calm. "Think about the last thing you do remember. Where were you?" The girl's eyebrows furrowed, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. "I was in a car." Edward's jaw tightened. "With who?" She took a breath, her little hands balling into fists at her sides. "A man and a woman. But not my mom. Not my dad." His pulse quickened slightly. "Did they say anything to you?" She nodded, gripping the hem of her shirt. "They said to be quiet. That I had to wait. And that someone would come for me." Edward exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, though every instinct in him told him this was worse than he had originally thought. A child who had been with people who weren't her parents, who had been told to wait for someone, who had been left in the middle of an airport with no memory of how she got there. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else entirely. Before he could say anything, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the name on the screen. "James." He answered immediately. "Tell me you're here." "Just pulled up," his assistant replied. "Where are you?" "Gate C, near the security checkpoint." "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Edward ended the call and looked back at the girl. "Someone I trust is coming. He'll help us figure this out." She nodded but didn't say anything. True to his word, James arrived within minutes, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before landing on Edward and the girl. He was a man who was used to dealing with high-pressure situations, accustomed to handling last-minute changes in plans and executing solutions with precision. But even James hesitated for a fraction of a second when he saw the child standing beside Edward, holding onto his sleeve like she belonged there. "Sir," James greeted, his tone level but questioning. Edward straightened. "We have a situation." James's gaze flickered between him and the girl, assessing. "I see that. Who is she?" "That's what we're going to find out." James nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "We could have security check the cameras, see who she came in with." Edward shook his head. "She doesn't want to go to security. And based on what she's told me, I'm not sure I trust whoever brought her here to be looking for her." James absorbed this information quickly, then turned to the girl, softening his usually professional demeanor. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, glancing at Edward before answering. "I don't remember." James didn't react outwardly, but Edward knew him well enough to catch the small shift in his expression. "All right," James said carefully. "What's the plan?" Edward glanced down at the girl, then back at James. "We take her with us." James blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Sir, you're supposed to be on a flight in 2 hours." Edward exhaled, glancing at his watch. That flight, that trip, suddenly felt completely insignificant. "Cancel it," he said. James didn't question him further. He simply pulled out his phone and started making the necessary calls. Edward looked back down at the girl. "We're going somewhere safe." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. And just like that, his entire life shifted. For the first time in years, he was walking away from a meticulously planned schedule, stepping into something completely unknown. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't regret it. Edward had never brought anyone to his penthouse before. His home was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, built for a man who had no time for unnecessary distractions. Everything inside it was curated, minimalist furniture, clean lines, neutral colors. It was a place where he could think, work, and exist without the chaos of the outside world interrupting him. But now, as he stepped inside with the little girl still holding onto his sleeve, he realized just how empty it truly was. She hesitated at the entrance, her small frame still tense, her blue eyes scanning the space with caution. She wasn't like most children her age, there was no wide-eyed curiosity, no immediate interest in exploring. Instead, she stood stiffly, as if afraid that stepping further inside would mean she was intruding. Edward turned to James, who had followed them in, already scanning the room like the well-trained problem solver he was. He wasn't just an assistant, he was the closest thing Edward had to a right hand, someone who had handled crises far beyond missed meetings and last-minute travel changes. "We need information," Edward said, his voice level. "No one just abandons a child in an airport without a reason." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll start with private investigators. Someone has to be looking for her." Edward glanced down at the girl, her grip on his sleeve having loosened but not fully released. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated for a second before nodding. He wasn't used to asking those kinds of questions, let alone figuring out how to accommodate a child. His kitchen was rarely used, stocked mostly with high-end coffee, protein bars, and the occasional meal prepared by his staff when he worked late. He walked toward the fridge, opening it to scan what was inside, before realizing that nothing in there was suitable for a 6-year-old. Without missing a beat, James took over. "I'll have food delivered." Edward nodded, grateful for the quick solution. The girl stood by the large windows now, looking out at the city skyline. The view from his penthouse was something most people would admire, floor-to-ceiling glass that showcased the sprawling lights of downtown, the pulse of a city that never truly slept. But she didn't seem fascinated by it. She just stared, as if trying to piece together where she was and what came next. He walked over to her, standing at a slight distance so as not to overwhelm her. "Do you remember anything?" She shifted slightly, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt. "I remember being in a car," she murmured. "It was dark." Edward studied her carefully. "Was there anyone with you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A man and a woman. But they weren't my parents." His jaw tightened. "Did they say anything to you?" Her blue eyes flickered toward him, filled with something he didn't like seeing in a child, fear mixed with uncertainty, as if she was debating whether she should tell him. Finally, she whispered, "They told me to be quiet. That I had to wait for someone to come." Edward inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "And then they left you at the airport?" She nodded. James, who had been listening, lowered his phone slightly. "That doesn't sound like a random abandonment," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It sounds planned." Edward already knew that. He turned back to the girl. "Do you remember where they took you before the airport?" She frowned, pressing her lips together as if trying to recall something just out of reach. "A hotel, I think. The windows had curtains that didn't open." Edward exchanged a glance with James, who was already taking notes. "That narrows it down," James muttered. "I'll check nearby hotels near the airport." The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands tightening around the fabric of her shirt again. Edward watched her carefully. "Do you remember your name?" She hesitated longer this time. For a second, he thought she might not answer at all. But then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Lily." It wasn't much. But it was something. Edward knelt slightly so he could meet her gaze. "All right, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "Until we figure out who you belong to, you're staying here." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. James glanced at him but didn't argue. Lily's small fingers tightened around the hem of her shirt again. "You won't leave me?" The question hit him harder than he anticipated. Edward exhaled slowly. "No," he said simply. "I won't." Lily studied him for a long moment before finally relaxing her shoulders just a little. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the first step. Edward had never been a man who second-guessed himself. Every decision he made was deliberate, every move calculated. But as he stood in his penthouse, watching a 6-year-old girl quietly nibble on a sandwich at his kitchen counter, he realized that this was the first situation in a long time where he had no clear strategy. Lily hadn't said much since she arrived. She ate cautiously, her small hands gripping the sandwich carefully, as if she was still waiting for someone to take it away. Edward noticed how she sat stiffly, her posture too controlled for a child her age, her blue eyes darting around the room like she was still trying to decide if this place was safe. He had seen the same behavior in boardrooms, in negotiations where people sat across from him, unsure of how much they could trust the man on the other side of the table. But this wasn't business. This was a little girl who had been abandoned at an airport, with no memory of her last name, no idea who had left her there, and no one coming to claim her. James stood a few feet away, his phone in hand as he went through the latest updates from the private investigators Edward had hired. "No reports of a missing child matching her description," he said, his voice low but sharp with concern. "No one's filed anything, no alerts, nothing in the databases." Edward frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Someone had to bring her there. Someone should be looking for her." James nodded, scrolling through his notes. "There was security footage from the airport. We're still reviewing it, but the initial report says she wasn't dropped off at the main entrance. They think she was left inside near the departure gates. No record of anyone reporting a lost child, no adults seen looking for her." Edward's grip tightened around his coffee cup. "So they left her there deliberately?" James hesitated before nodding. "It looks that way." Edward exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had spent years building an empire where problems were solved with ruthless efficiency. This wasn't something he could fix with a well-placed call or a carefully negotiated deal. This was a child, alone and abandoned, and the more he learned, the worse it got. Lily had finished eating, setting the plate down with quiet precision. She glanced up at him, as if waiting to see what would happen next. He leaned against the counter, keeping his voice even. "How do you feel?" She hesitated before answering. "Better." "Good," he said. "You can stay here for now. Until we figure this out." She studied him for a long moment. "But what if no one comes for me?" Edward felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just asking for reassurance, she was preparing for the possibility that she had been left behind for good. He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to promise something he wasn't sure of. But he did know one thing. "If that happens," he said carefully, "we'll figure out something else. You're not alone in this." Lily nodded, but the way she lowered her gaze told him she wasn't sure if she could believe him yet. James cleared his throat slightly, checking his watch. "I'll keep pressing our sources. In the meantime, what do you want me to do about?" He gestured slightly toward Lily, leaving the rest unsaid. Edward understood the question. What was the plan? What came next? He had no idea. But looking at the girl sitting quietly in his kitchen, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual. His internal clock was tuned to business meetings, early flights, and high-stakes negotiations, but today was different. His mind wasn't on work, wasn't on the upcoming deals that his company was finalizing. Instead, it was on the small girl who had fallen asleep in the guest room down the hall. He had checked on her late last night, standing in the doorway for longer than he cared to admit. She had curled up beneath the heavy blankets, her small frame barely taking up space in the large bed. Her breathing had been even, but her hand had remained tightly wrapped around the fabric of her pillow, as if bracing herself for something. Now, as he stood in the kitchen, brewing his usual black coffee, he realized he had no idea how to start a morning with a child in his house. He was a man of strict routine, built around efficiency. Breakfast was something that happened on the go, usually prepared by his house staff or eaten at the office between meetings. But now, with Lily here, that wasn't going to work. James arrived just as Edward was staring at the fridge, realizing that nothing inside it was remotely appropriate for a 6-year-old. His assistant stepped into the kitchen, pausing briefly before raising an eyebrow. "You're making breakfast?" James asked, amusement clear in his tone. Edward exhaled, closing the fridge door. "I was considering it." James smirked. "And? There's nothing here she'll eat." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll have something delivered." Edward appreciated the efficiency, but something about it didn't sit right. The girl had been left alone at an airport, abandoned without an explanation. The least he could do was make sure she felt safe now. "Cancel it," he said, rolling up the sleeves of his dress shirt. "I'll do it myself." James didn't argue, but his smirk deepened. "This I have to see." Edward ignored him and focused on the task at hand. He found eggs and bread, something simple enough to work with. As he moved through the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan, he caught James watching him like he was witnessing something unbelievable. "Don't you have something more productive to do?" Edward muttered. James leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "This is the most productive thing I've seen you do in years." Before Edward could respond, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lily appeared at the edge of the kitchen, still in the oversized t-shirt James had brought for her last night. Her blonde hair was slightly messy from sleep, and she hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure if she was allowed to step inside. Edward turned to her, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." She blinked, her blue eyes flicking between him and James before cautiously making her way to a chair. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, watching as he finished cooking. When he placed a plate in front of her, she looked down at it for a moment, her small fingers lightly gripping the edge. She took a careful bite, chewing thoughtfully before glancing up at him. "You made this?" she asked, as if the idea was almost impossible. Edward nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then took another bite. "It's not bad." James snorted, and Edward shot him a warning glance before turning his attention back to Lily. "You can tell me if you don't like something," he said, watching her carefully. "You don't have to be polite." Lily shrugged. "I do like it." She took another bite, slower this time. "I just don't remember the last time someone made breakfast for me." Edward felt something shift in his chest, a quiet ache he didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't push for more information. Instead, he sat down across from her, his own plate untouched as he watched her eat. James cleared his throat, checking his phone. "Our people are still looking into any missing persons cases. No updates yet." Lily's shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of missing persons, but she didn't say anything. Edward exhaled. "We'll figure it out." Lily glanced up at him, her blue eyes cautious but searching. "And if you don't?" He didn't hesitate. Then you stay here. She stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. But for the first time, she looked just a little less afraid. Edward had never been the type of man to second-guess his decisions. He built an empire on certainty, on knowing the outcome before he even made a move. But as he sat in his office later that morning, reviewing documents on his laptop, he found his thoughts drifting away from work, something that rarely, if ever, happened. Lily was in the next room, where James had set up a quiet space for her with books, puzzles, and a small television. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't complained, hadn't made a sound since she finished breakfast. That was what unsettled him the most. Most children would have been asking questions by now, demanding to know what was going to happen next, clinging to whatever adult was closest in search of comfort. But Lily simply existed in silence, as if she was trying not to take up space, as if she had already learned that asking for things led to disappointment. Edward exhaled, closing his laptop. He wasn't the type to ignore problems, and this, whatever this was, wasn't something he could afford to push aside. He stood, walking to the adjoining room where Lily was sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping absently through the pages of a book she wasn't really reading. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded, as if preparing herself for something. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "What do you usually do during the day?" She blinked, as if the question had surprised her. "I don't know." "You don't know?" She hesitated, fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the book. "I move around a lot. I don't always get to do the same things." Something cold settled in Edward's chest. "You move around a lot." She nodded. "We never stayed anywhere for too long." His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Who was we?" Lily's small fingers gripped the book a little tighter. "My mom." Edward waited, but she didn't say anything else. He chose his next words carefully. "And the people who left you at the airport?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression. A brief flash of something he couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or uncertainty. She looked down at the book, running her fingers over the page before answering. "They weren't my mom." Edward exhaled slowly, pushing away the frustration he felt building inside him. He didn't want to press her, didn't want to force something she wasn't ready to say. But every piece of information she gave him only confirmed what he already suspected: this was bigger than just a lost child. He walked over and sat in the chair across from her, keeping enough distance to make sure she didn't feel trapped. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But until then, I need you to tell me if anything doesn't feel right. If you remember something important. If you feel scared." Lily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not she believed him. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Okay." Edward studied her for a second longer before nodding in return. "Good." She went back to flipping through the book, her posture a little more relaxed than before. As he stood to leave, she suddenly spoke again. "Are you going back to work now?" Edward paused, glancing at her. "I was." Lily tilted her head slightly, considering that. "You don't have to stay with me all the time. I can be quiet." Edward let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not the point." She watched him carefully. "Then what is the point?" He hesitated for a second before answering. "You're not something I can just ignore, Lily." She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for him to see it. It wasn't trust, not yet. But maybe, for the first time, it was the beginning of something close. That evening, Edward found himself doing something he never thought he would, adjusting his entire schedule for someone else. His life had always been dictated by structure, by efficiency, by the next deal, the next acquisition, the next step in expanding his empire. He had never let anything interfere with that. But now, there was a 6-year-old girl in his home, sitting at his kitchen table, stirring a spoon absent-mindedly in a bowl of soup she had barely touched. She wasn't refusing to eat, but she wasn't really engaging with the meal either. She seemed lost in thought, her blue eyes flicking to the large windows that overlooked the glowing city skyline. Edward sat across from her, watching carefully. He had spent years reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were holding something back, when they were about to make a move that would change the course of a negotiation. But Lily wasn't a business deal, and that made her harder to read. He took a sip of his own drink before speaking. "You don't like the soup?" She shook her head, barely lifting her spoon. "It's fine." That didn't answer the question. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm just not really hungry." Edward set his glass down. "Because of everything that's going on?" Lily looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He leaned back slightly, considering his next words. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated again, but this time, she didn't shake her head. That was progress. She looked down at her spoon, stirring the liquid again. "I don't know what's supposed to happen next." Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. He had built his entire life on knowing what came next, but this was unfamiliar territory for both of them. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tapped her spoon against the side of the bowl, thinking. "I want to know where my mom is," she finally said. Edward nodded, his chest tightening slightly. That was the one thing he couldn't give her, not yet. "I want to know if she's okay," Lily added quietly. "And if she's not, I want to know why she didn't come for me." Her voice was steady, but Edward could hear the uncertainty beneath it, the way she was trying not to sound as scared as she really was. He leaned forward slightly. "James is still looking. He's using every resource we have to find her. But until we do, I don't want you to worry about what-ifs. We'll figure it out when we get there." Lily looked up at him, searching his face for something. "And what if we never do?" Edward didn't answer right away. He knew better than to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But what he could promise was that she wouldn't go through this alone. "Then we deal with that, too," he said firmly. Lily studied him, her blue eyes unreadable, but there was something in her posture that relaxed just slightly. She picked up her spoon and took a small bite of the soup. Edward didn't say anything, didn't push for more conversation. But he stayed seated across from her until she had finished. That night, after she had gone to bed, he found himself standing outside her room, staring at the closed door longer than necessary. For the first time in his life, his priorities had shifted. And he didn't regret it. This story is more than just a tale of a powerful man whose life is disrupted by an unexpected responsibility. It's about transformation, about how even the most controlled and structured lives can be unraveled by something as simple, and as profound, as human connection. Edward Stanton begins as a man defined by power, wealth, and a strict sense of order. He has spent years building an empire, making decisions with ruthless efficiency, and ensuring that nothing and no one can shake his carefully constructed world. But when Lily enters his life, everything changes. What makes this story compelling is not just the mystery surrounding Lily, who she is, where she came from, and why she was abandoned, but the way she forces Edward to confront something he has never faced before, responsibility that cannot be delegated, controlled, or reasoned away. For the first time, he is faced with a problem that doesn't have a strategic solution, only a human one. The ending is powerful not because Edward suddenly becomes a perfect father figure overnight, but because he chooses to stay. He chooses to be there, to be someone Lily can rely on, even when the answers about her past remain uncertain. The true resolution isn't just in finding out what happened to Lily's mother or uncovering the truth about her past, it's in the bond that grows between them, in the moment Lily finally starts to believe she is safe, and in the realization that Edward, for all his success, was missing something far greater than he ever understood. This is a story about change, about how sometimes the most unexpected people enter our lives and turn everything upside down, forcing us to see what truly matters. Edward thought he had everything, but in the end, it wasn't his wealth or his power that defined him. It was the simple act of holding on when someone needed him the most. And that, more than anything, made him the man he was always meant to be. The millionaire CEO was calmly sipping his coffee in his office when a little girl's desperate scream outside his door stopped the entire building, and nothing in his life made sense after that moment. Charles Bennett began his morning the way he always did, early, sharp, and uninterrupted. The skyline spread wide outside his 34th floor office window, painted in golden tones by the rising sun. His assistant had already brought in his usual double espresso, his tie was immaculate, and the financial report on his tablet glowed with perfect numbers. It was a routine Charles relied on, a daily structure that kept his life neat, professional, and completely controlled. That control shattered the moment a high-pitched scream pierced the quiet air outside his office. He looked up immediately, frowning, unsure if what he heard was real. Another scream followed, unmistakably a child's voice. It echoed down the marble-lined corridor just beyond his office door. Charles stood and moved toward the sound. As he opened the door, he was met with a scene that felt surreal. A security guard was standing in the reception area, holding back a small girl who was struggling in his grasp. She couldn't have been more than 6. She had wavy blonde hair that framed her round face in disarray, and large brown eyes that were wide with panic. Her small fists were clenched, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Let me go. I need to talk to him," she cried, trying to wrench herself free. The guard noticed Charles and looked apologetic. "Sir," she ran past the front desk. "Says she knows you. I was just escorting her out." The girl caught sight of Charles and immediately stopped struggling. Her gaze locked on him, and she froze as if time had stopped. Her bottom lip trembled. "You're Mr. Bennett," she said softly, breathless, like she had just finished a race. Charles stepped closer, still confused. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" The girl swallowed hard and took a small step forward. "My name is Ellie. My mommy is in the hospital. She said if anything ever happened, I should come find you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she reached into the backpack slung over one shoulder, pulling out a folded photograph. Her hands were shaking as she handed it to him. Charles unfolded the photo and felt his entire body go still. It was him, 10 years younger, arm around a woman he had not seen in 6 years. Julia. She was smiling, and so was he, frozen in a moment that felt like a lifetime ago. Charles looked up from the photograph, suddenly seeing the resemblance in Ellie's eyes, in the shape of her mouth. His heart thudded, once, hard. "My mom is Julia," Ellie said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "She said if she couldn't talk, I should come to you. She said you would help. Please, please don't send me away." The security guard looked to Charles for direction, clearly uncertain. Charles couldn't speak right away. His throat had gone dry. He looked at Ellie again and saw something he hadn't expected, something fragile and urgent and real. Without thinking, he nodded. "It's okay," he said to the guard. "She's staying. She's with me." And with that sentence, his entire world quietly, and irrevocably, shifted. Charles stood frozen in the middle of the lobby as Ellie's words echoed inside him. Nothing about the moment made sense, and yet every instinct told him it was real. The photograph in his hand confirmed it. There he was, younger and more relaxed, with his arm wrapped around Julia's waist. She was smiling at the camera, her hair windblown, and his expression, once unfamiliar to him, now stared back with a kind of intimacy that made his chest tighten. He remembered that weekend. They had gone to the coast for no reason, rented a small cottage, stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. It had been one of the last times he'd let himself be fully present in someone else's world. And then he left. He looked down at the little girl who was now standing quietly beside him, holding the strap of her backpack with one hand and rubbing her eye with the other. She looked tired. Not just from running into his office, but with the kind of exhaustion that children shouldn't carry. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, cautious but hopeful. "She told me your name," she said again, quieter now. "She told me you used to be important to her." That word, used to be, landed with more weight than he expected. He gently placed the photo on the reception desk and crouched down to Ellie's level. "Where is your mom now?" he asked, carefully. "What happened?" Ellie fidgeted, then pulled a crumpled note from her coat pocket. "The hospital gave me this. She fainted at work and wouldn't wake up. Someone called an ambulance. I was at school, and then I waited, but no one came to pick me up. So I went home, and then I remembered what she said." Charles took the paper from her and scanned it. It was a discharge summary from the emergency room, signed with Julia's name and an urgent message scribbled at the bottom: "If anything happens to me, find Charles Bennett." There was an address and nothing else. It didn't explain what she had, how bad it was, or who had been watching Ellie in the meantime. And the worst part was, she had apparently trusted that he, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, would step up. He stood and looked at the guard, who was now clearly uncomfortable. "Tell Elise to clear my afternoon," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "And have the car brought around." The guard hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Charles cut in, gently placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We're going to the hospital." Ellie didn't say anything on the elevator ride down. She stayed close to his side, holding her bear-shaped keychain in both hands. Charles glanced at her more than once, trying to understand how he could have possibly missed this. Julia had been gone from his life for 6 years, and in that time she had carried a child, raised her, protected her, and never once reached out. Why? Was it pride? Pain? Or had she simply assumed he wouldn't care? When the car pulled up to the emergency entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, Charles helped Ellie out and led her inside. The woman at the reception desk looked up and blinked in surprise when she saw him. He was used to that, his face occasionally appeared in the business news, but this wasn't a boardroom. He explained who he was, gave Julia's full name, and waited as the woman tapped at her keyboard. "She was admitted this morning," she confirmed. "Internal bleeding. She's in observation. No visitors allowed yet except family." Charles hesitated. He didn't know if he had the right to say it. But then Ellie stepped forward and whispered, "He is family." The receptionist paused for a long moment, then nodded slowly and gestured toward the waiting area. "Take a seat. A nurse will update you when she's stable." Charles led Ellie to one of the plastic chairs and sat down beside her. She curled up next to him, hugging her backpack, her legs drawn to her chest. He looked at her again, really looked. The way she tilted her head, the curve of her mouth when she frowned, even the small, focused crease between her brows, all of it reminded him of Julia. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about quarterly targets or investor calls or mergers. He was thinking about a woman he'd once loved, and the child he never knew he had, now asleep against his side. Charles sat silently in the waiting room, the noise of hospital monitors and intercom announcements distant and muffled compared to the weight of the child leaning against his side. Ellie had fallen asleep, her head resting just below his shoulder, her small body curled in a way that told him she'd done this before, waited, worried, endured in silence. He kept his arm gently around her, unsure if it was for her comfort or his own. The sterile white walls, the scent of disinfectant, the ticking clock on the far wall, everything reminded him that this wasn't just a detour in his day anymore. This was something irreversible. Something he couldn't walk away from, even if he wanted to. A nurse finally approached with cautious steps and a clipboard hugged to her chest. She glanced down at Ellie before addressing Charles quietly. "You're listed as emergency contact," she said. "Ms. Davis is stable." She regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. She's still weak, but coherent. Charles exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. What happened? The nurse hesitated. There's a history of untreated anemia. She collapsed at work. She lost a lot of blood before paramedics arrived. We're giving her transfusions now, and we'll keep her overnight for monitoring. She was lucky her daughter didn't panic. Her eyes flicked briefly to Ellie, still asleep. That little girl kept calm, remembered your name and address. That's not nothing. Charles nodded slowly. The nurse led him down a hallway while another nurse stayed with Ellie. With every step toward the recovery room, he felt the weight of old choices pressing harder against his spine. The last time he had seen Julia, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no tears, just a final disagreement and an unspoken understanding that their lives were heading in different directions. She had been disappointed, yes, but she hadn't begged. And he had assumed that silence meant closure. Now he realized it had been something else entirely. When he stepped into her room, the light was low and Julia looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Her skin was pale, her hair disheveled against the pillow, but her eyes were the same, sharp and steady and unafraid. She looked at him and didn't speak right away. For a moment, they just studied each other as though trying to account for 6 years in a single glance. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said finally, her voice hoarse but clear. Ellie said she found you. I didn't think she'd remember the name. Charles stepped closer to the bed, unable to form words. She said I'm her father, he said at last, more a question than a statement. Julia gave a slow nod. She's 6. I found out I was pregnant not long after we split. I didn't call you because I didn't know if you'd want to know. You were already gone. Her eyes didn't accuse him. They just told the truth. I should have known, he said quietly. I should have asked. I should have, Julia shook her head slightly. There's no point going backward. You're here now. That's what matters to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many missing pieces, too many years to fill in. But Charles felt something settle inside him, something raw and painful but honest. She's incredible, he said. Smart. Brave. She showed up at my office like she was on a mission. Julia smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in her tired expression. She is brave. She gets that from me. Then, softer, but she watches people the way you do. Charles pulled the chair closer to the bed. What happens now? He asked. What do you need? Julia looked at him, not just as an old love or a past mistake, but as a man who was trying to show up, finally. Right now, I need to rest. And Ellie needs someone to take her home and make sure she eats something that isn't vending machine food. Charles stood and nodded. I can do that. He started toward the door, but paused. I'd like to be part of her life. I don't know how to do this. But I want to learn. If you'll let me. Julia looked at him a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet breath, she said, then don't just say it. Show it. As he walked back down the hall to find Ellie, Charles felt the weight of that final sentence settle into his bones. Not a challenge. A chance. A doorway he had never opened before. And this time, he didn't intend to close it. Charles returned to the waiting area to find Ellie still asleep, curled on the chair with her jacket as a makeshift blanket and her small backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. He sat down quietly beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath, struck by how peaceful she looked despite everything she'd endured in the last 24 hours. It amazed him that she had navigated a crisis most adults would crumble under, guided only by a name and a photograph. That strength wasn't just a product of survival, it was clearly something Julia had instilled in her. After a few minutes, Ellie stirred. Her eyes blinked open, still cloudy with sleep, and when she saw him sitting beside her, she didn't jump or question it. She simply said, "Is she okay?" Charles nodded slowly. "She's awake. The doctors are taking care of her. She asked me to take you home and make sure you eat something better than hospital snacks." Ellie seemed to consider that, then sat up and rubbed her eyes. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" she asked. The question surprised him. He expected tears or silence, not breakfast requests. "I haven't made pancakes in a while," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try if you'll supervise." On the drive to her apartment, Ellie stared out the window, quiet but calm. She wasn't afraid of him, and that surprised Charles more than anything. She didn't treat him like a stranger. In fact, her presence had a natural ease to it, as if she had somehow already decided that he belonged in her world. At a red light, he looked over and asked, "Do you want to talk about what happened today?" Ellie shrugged. "Not really. Mom gets sick sometimes. This one was just worse." There was no drama in her tone, just the matter-of-fact voice of a child who had learned how to live through uncertainty. He nodded and let the silence return. Her apartment was small, clean, and filled with signs of a life built on effort. There were drawings on the fridge held up with mismatched magnets, a pair of rain boots by the door, a couch that looked older than Ellie but clearly loved. He helped her unpack her bag, found cereal in the cupboard and milk that hadn't expired, and managed to scramble some eggs. She insisted on setting the table, even though it was just the two of them, and then asked him questions between bites, how old he was, what kind of car he drove, whether he liked dogs. It was surreal. She didn't ask about why he hadn't been there, at least not yet, but he knew that question would come. For now, she was trying to understand him in pieces, one small curiosity at a time. After lunch, Ellie pulled out a box of puzzles and invited him to help. They sat on the floor, arranging corners and edges, working quietly but side by side. It wasn't just about the puzzle. It was about time, about space, about testing whether he would stay. When the final piece clicked into place, she smiled and said, "That was faster than when I do it alone." Charles felt something warm spread through his chest. "Everything's easier when you have someone helping you," he replied. She nodded and leaned back on her hands. "Mom says that too." As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, Charles helped her pack an overnight bag to bring back to the hospital, along with one of her favorite books and a small stuffed bear with a worn-out ribbon. He asked if she wanted to go back with him to see her mom again. She hesitated, then nodded. "But only if you promise to hold my hand in the elevator. I don't like the beeping sounds." He held out his hand without a word. She took it and didn't let go. That evening, when they stepped into Julia's room again, Ellie ran to her mother's side and climbed into the chair beside the bed. Charles stood back at first, watching them, but Julia motioned for him to come closer. She looked tired but stronger, her skin no longer as pale, her eyes clearer. "You did okay today," she said softly. He didn't smile, but he felt her words settle into something inside him he didn't know had been empty. "We did okay," he said. Then he looked down at Ellie, her hand wrapped around Julia's fingers and the other still loosely holding his. He realized that this wasn't just one day of stepping in. It was the beginning of staying. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be anywhere else. The following days unfolded in a way Charles hadn't anticipated. What began as a single act of responsibility had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't compartmentalize or schedule around. Julia remained in the hospital under observation, her condition steadily improving but still requiring rest. With no close relatives nearby and her closest friend out of state, Charles became the person responsible for Ellie, not just legally, but emotionally. And surprisingly, he didn't resist it. He embraced it with a quiet determination, although everything about it felt new and unsteady. Ellie had returned to her usual routine of school during the day, but now Charles was the one picking her up. The first morning he tried, he arrived 10 minutes early, unsure of where to stand or what to say. He stayed near the gate, watching other parents chatting, greeting each other with the comfort of repetition. He felt out of place, an outsider who wore his confusion behind an expensive coat and polished shoes. But then Ellie spotted him from across the playground, ran toward him with her backpack bouncing behind her, and smiled like seeing him there was the most natural thing in the world. That smile grounded him more than any boardroom ever had. Back at Julia's apartment, he began adapting to the rhythms of life with a child. Mornings were filled with cereal spills, missing shoes, and debates over which cartoon should be playing in the background. Evenings were slower, homework he didn't understand but tried to help with anyway, simple dinners made together with more laughter than accuracy, and stories read aloud with voices that made Ellie giggle until she fell asleep with her cheek against his arm. The simplicity of the routine became sacred. Each moment stitched into his day a clarity he hadn't known he needed. At night, once Ellie was asleep, Charles would sit in the living room and go through emails, but he no longer answered most of them. He paused at messages from board members or investors, sometimes typing replies only to delete them. For the first time in his life, work didn't feel urgent. What felt urgent was whether Ellie had remembered her lunch for school, or if Julia's chart showed improvement, or if Ellie's stuffed bear, which she now insisted Charles tuck into bed, had been fluffed properly. He visited Julia each evening after dinner, bringing Ellie with him unless she was too tired. Each visit felt less awkward than the last. Julia watched him carefully in those moments, not just with curiosity but with cautious trust. They spoke about practical things at first, Ellie's bedtime, medications, bills, but eventually, the conversations drifted. She asked him about his company, and he told her honestly how hard it was to concentrate. He asked her what she planned to do when she got home, and she admitted she hadn't thought past tomorrow. There was no pressure in their words, no weight of needing to define what this new shape between them was becoming. But it was becoming something. That much was clear. One night, as Charles and Ellie were leaving the hospital, she reached for his hand without being prompted. As they walked to the car, she said, "Mom says I'm brave, but I think you're learning to be too." He stopped walking for a moment, taken off guard by the simplicity of her words. Then he squeezed her hand gently and nodded. "I think you might be right." She grinned, swinging his hand slightly, as if that settled the matter completely. Back at the apartment, after Ellie had fallen asleep and the dishes were cleared, Charles sat in the dim light of the kitchen and thought about everything he'd built in his life that now seemed so far away. His penthouse, his board meetings, his title, all of it paled in comparison to the quiet peace of brushing Ellie's hair back before bed, or the half-smile Julia gave him whenever he made her laugh. He realized he hadn't just stepped into their world. He had been welcomed into it. And now he couldn't imagine walking away. The sixth morning began with rain. A steady, drumming kind that tapped gently against the windows of Julia's apartment and made the world outside look softer, quieter. Inside, the living room was filled with the scent of cinnamon toast and the sound of Ellie's feet hopping between tile patterns on the floor, pretending they were stepping stones over lava. Charles stood at the kitchen counter pouring orange juice, wearing a wrinkled white shirt and mismatched socks, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care that he looked disheveled. He was beginning to understand that there was a kind of power in being present rather than polished. When Ellie sat down at the table, she asked if she could visit her mother again after school. Charles said yes without hesitation. He had already planned to pick her up and drive straight to the hospital, even before she asked. The way Ellie checked her backpack twice before leaving, the way she tucked her small sketchbook inside to show her mom a new drawing, it was clear she had built her week around those short hospital visits. He understood now that consistency was more important than perfection, and that being there, every day, mattered more than any apology could. After he dropped Ellie at school, Charles sat in his car longer than usual, his hands still on the wheel, thinking about Julia. Her condition had stabilized enough that doctors expected her to be discharged in a few days. The news should have brought relief, but instead, it stirred a storm of uncertainty inside him. He knew she would need help, real, ongoing help, not just rides to appointments or meals reheated from frozen trays. She would need rest, support, and most of all, someone she could rely on without question. He had never been that person before. But he wanted to be now. Later that day, after picking up Ellie and grabbing her favorite cookies from a nearby bakery, they arrived at the hospital just before sunset. Julia was sitting up in bed when they entered, pale but smiling. Her hair had been washed and combed back, and though her frame still looked fragile beneath the hospital blanket, there was color in her cheeks again. Ellie climbed onto the edge of the bed and pulled out her sketchbook, talking so quickly about her school day that the words nearly tripped over each other. Julia listened, her hand resting gently on her daughter's knee, nodding, laughing softly, occasionally glancing at Charles with a kind of quiet gratitude. After Ellie ran down the hall with a nurse to grab a juice box, Charles sat in the chair beside Julia's bed. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then she turned toward him and said, "You've done more than I expected." Her voice wasn't accusing, but honest. "You didn't owe us anything. You didn't even know she existed." Charles looked at her, steady and certain. "Maybe I didn't owe you something in the past," he said carefully. "But I do now. And it's not because I feel guilty. It's because this, being with her, helping you, it's the only thing that's made sense in years." Julia watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I don't know how to rebuild something that never really existed," she said softly. "I don't want to confuse her, or myself. I don't want to pretend like time didn't pass." "We can't rewrite what happened," Charles replied. "But maybe we can write something new. If you let me." He expected resistance, some wall to go up, but instead Julia sighed and leaned her head back against the pillow. "It's not just about letting you. It's about trusting you. Not just when things are convenient, but when they're hard." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll show you, every day, that I mean it." Just then, Ellie ran back into the room, juice box in hand and cheeks flushed with excitement. She plopped into the chair between them and announced, "Mom says I can teach you how to braid hair." Charles blinked, surprised, and Julia laughed. "I may have mentioned your styling skills need some work." Charles raised both hands. "Fair enough. I'll accept the training." That night, as they left the hospital, Ellie asked if he would still be there when her mom came home. Without hesitation, he said, "I will." And when she slipped her hand into his as they crossed the parking lot, he felt it again, that quiet, powerful shift inside him. The kind that didn't make noise, but changed everything. 3 days later, Julia was discharged from the hospital. The morning was bright and cloudless, a quiet contrast to the uncertainty that had shaped the past week. Charles had made sure everything at the apartment was ready, fresh sheets on the bed, groceries in the fridge, and medications picked up and sorted neatly into a pill organizer. He even fixed the flickering light in the hallway, something Julia had apparently been ignoring for months. He wasn't trying to impress her. He simply wanted her to come home and feel like she could rest. Not like she had to return to survival mode. Ellie was waiting at the front door when Charles brought Julia home. The little girl bounced on her toes with nervous energy, wearing a crown made of paper and glue, which she insisted was to welcome her queen. When the door opened and Julia stepped inside, slower than usual but smiling, Ellie ran to hug her, wrapping her small arms gently around her waist. Julia closed her eyes and held her daughter close, her expression softening in a way Charles hadn't seen before. It was the kind of reunion that was quiet, not dramatic, but filled with all the emotion they hadn't let themselves feel earlier. Julia took slow steps through the apartment, reacquainting herself with her own space, and seemed surprised by how much it already looked and felt like more than a place to sleep. There were little changes, blankets folded differently, dishes rearranged, Ellie's drawings framed on the wall in simple dollar store frames. "You did all this?" she asked, glancing over at Charles. He nodded, almost sheepishly. "I figured you shouldn't come home to chaos." She didn't say thank you out loud, but the way she looked at him said enough. That first night was different. Charles stayed late, helping Julia get settled while Ellie insisted on making dinner. Dinner, in her case, meant peanut butter sandwiches cut into star shapes, carrot sticks, and juice poured carefully with both hands. They sat at the table together, three people who had once been strangers now forming something tentative and real. There were moments of silence, but none of them were uncomfortable. It felt like breathing had become easier for all of them, like some invisible thread had pulled them into alignment without anyone needing to force it. Later that evening, Charles offered to read Ellie her bedtime story while Julia took her first proper shower in days. Ellie chose a book about a magical forest and climbed into bed with her stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. As he read, she interrupted with questions, half of which didn't relate to the story, but he answered each one anyway. When the book ended, she turned to him and said, "Are you going to stay tomorrow too?" He hesitated for just a second. "If it's okay with your mom," he replied. She nodded, satisfied. "I think she wants you to." Then she reached up and touched his cheek in a way that was unguarded, trusting. "You're a good reader," she said, before curling into her pillow and closing her eyes. Charles sat there for a while, watching her breathe, thinking about how strange it was to love someone so quickly and so deeply that it frightened you. But he didn't pull away. He stayed until her breathing grew steady. When he stepped out of Ellie's room, Julia was sitting on the couch in fresh pajamas, hair damp, a cup of tea between her hands. She looked rested, but wary. Charles joined her without asking. They sat in silence again, but it was the kind that invited honesty. Finally, she spoke. "You've changed. You listen more. You're not always looking past the moment like you used to." Charles looked down at his hands. "I had to lose a lot before I realized what mattered. But even when I had everything, I felt like something was missing. Now, for the first time, I don't." Julia studied him for a moment, then took a sip of her tea. "I don't know what this is between us. I'm not ready to name it. But I do know that Ellie needs you. And I need you too. In a way I didn't expect." Charles met her eyes. "Then let's not rush to name it. Let's just build it. One piece at a time." She nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, Charles didn't go back to his penthouse. He slept on the couch, blanket over him, Ellie's stuffed bear sitting on the coffee table like a silent guardian. And when morning came, with the smell of toast and laughter from the kitchen, he woke up to something he hadn't known he craved, a life that wasn't perfect, but finally felt like home. A month passed, and life settled into a rhythm none of them had expected but all of them quietly embraced. Charles no longer kept his phone on during dinner. He stopped checking emails before bed. His team had adjusted to his reduced presence at the office, and though some questioned his shift in priorities, most understood that something in him had changed. And not in a scandalous, dramatic way, but in the way a person begins to show up for their life instead of racing past it. He still worked, still made decisions and took calls, but his hours were shorter, his boundaries firmer, and his evenings reserved for something far more important than boardrooms. Julia's recovery progressed steadily. The color returned to her face, her movements grew stronger, and she started taking walks with Ellie after school. She and Charles often stood together at the window, watching Ellie skip ahead on the sidewalk, talking to herself, the way kids do when they feel safe. Sometimes Julia would glance at Charles with that quiet smile she gave only when she thought he wasn't looking. And sometimes, he caught it anyway. They didn't talk about what they were, or what they might become, because there was something sacred about the way things were unfolding without labels. They lived in the moment, careful not to break the fragile trust that had taken so long to rebuild. One Saturday afternoon, they visited the park together. Ellie insisted on a picnic, packing sandwiches she helped make and lemonade she poured into mismatched cups. She brought her sketchbook too, and halfway through lunch, she handed Charles a drawing. It showed three figures again, this time clearer. A tall man, a woman in a red dress, and a girl holding both their hands. Above them, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My family." Charles blinked hard, looking at the paper longer than necessary. Julia reached over and gently squeezed his hand beneath the blanket. It was a simple moment, but to him, it felt monumental. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden streaks through the trees, Ellie ran off to chase a butterfly. Julia and Charles stayed on the blanket, the silence between them full but unspoken. Finally, she leaned her head on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him like that since the hospital. No discussion. No warning. Just quiet closeness that meant more than any speech could. He placed his hand over hers. No promises, no dramatic declarations, just presence. Commitment without pressure. He would stay. He already had. That evening, as they walked home, Ellie held both of their hands. She looked up at Charles and asked, "Do you think we'll always be like this?" He looked down at her and smiled softly. "I hope so," he said. "And I'll do my best to make sure of it." She seemed satisfied with that answer, skipping ahead again. When they got home, Ellie ran to her room to change into pajamas while Julia and Charles cleaned up the last of the picnic leftovers. In the kitchen, surrounded by crumbs and the fading smell of peanut butter and lemonade, she turned to him and said, "I don't think I could have done this without you." He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Maybe you could have. But I'm grateful you didn't have to." She nodded, eyes glistening, and leaned in to kiss his cheek. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the apartment had quieted, Charles stood in the hallway between her bedroom and the living room. He looked at the home around him, the toys on the floor, the half-folded laundry on the couch, the list of groceries pinned to the fridge, and felt a kind of peace he hadn't known was possible. It wasn't flashy or perfect. It wasn't the kind of success he could measure with numbers or praise. But it was real. And it was his. He didn't need the title or the corner office or the endless chase anymore. What he needed was here. In this home. With them. A place not defined by what he had left behind, but by what he had finally decided to hold on to. In the end, this story isn't about a millionaire or a grand twist, it's about quiet redemption, the kind that doesn't come with applause but with presence. What moved me most was how Charles didn't fix everything with money or grand gestures, but by simply showing up, staying when it was uncomfortable, and allowing himself to be transformed by connection. He didn't reclaim a past, he built something entirely new. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of healing, not erasing the mistakes, but choosing, day by day, to be better than them.